I'm continuing my discussion of the turmoil in Brazil. It's a little hard to say where this is going. It seems that institutionally, Lula da Silva has the support of the courts, and I say that because the courts have been A, very dismissive of claims of election fraud, B, have actually apparently been complicit in social media censorship in Brazil. This is a topic I want to talk about in more detail. I'll probably pick it up tomorrow. Twitter, for example, has been a major instrument of censorship for this is of course before the Elon Musk takeover of the Bolsonaro people in Brazil. So the court is on Lula's side, but the army and the military and apparently some of the police are on Bolsonaro's side. Now, the police were out in force, apparently intercepting a lot of the protesters, but there was also the police cracking down on protesters on the street. And so guess what happened? I'm actually looking at a video of this in social media, and that is that when the police began to deploy in force on the street to dispel the crowds, the army put tanks on the street to prevent the police from removing the protesters. So all of this suggests that there's still a volatile situation in Brazil, and Lula da Silva has his hands full in dealing with it. Now, Bolsonaro, interestingly, is in Florida. And apparently a bunch of left-wing Democrats I'm thinking here of AOC, Ilhan Omar, Joaquin Castro. They're like, we have to extradite him. We have to send him back to Brazil. Well, first of all, Bolsonaro is not under accusation. He didn't call for these protests. In fact, as far as I can tell, he has been relatively quiet and, in a sense, accepting of the election outcome. I say that because what does Bolsonaro do? He basically packs up and goes to Florida. I also saw somewhere that he is having some health issues and he might even be under health care or even in a hospital in Florida. Nevertheless, these claims for extradition seem to me absurd. There are no criminal charges or charges of any kind, as far as I know, against Bolsonaro. Now, Lula da Silva, a very bad guy. Not only is this guy a far leftist, a buddy of Castro, buddy of Maduro, a guy who came up through the radical left trade union movement in Brazil. But here is a guy who was also convicted of corruption. It's widely acknowledged, even by his own supporters, that his party is corrupt. Payment of bribes in exchange for government contracts. Lula da Silva served 580 days in prison when essentially the Supreme Court vacated his conviction by saying that the judge who ordered his incarceration was biased against him. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Supreme Court didn't say that Lula was not corrupt. It didn't exonerate him of the charges of corruption. They just said that because of the procedural bias of one of the judges, Lula should be set free. So this is all part of, I think, a troubling movement in Latin America to the left. We are seeing it in other Latin American countries now. I saw a Brazilian commentator talking about this, and he goes, look, Lula is not the same Lula. He doesn't have the same kind of power that he did when he was in office before. By the way, Lula has already served in office an extended term, I think 12 years. And he had a left-wing majority. He was able to get a lot of what he wanted. But according to this Brazilian commentator, this is not the situation now. In fact, the Bolsonaro people control the parliament. They have majorities in both the Brazilian houses of parliament, which is to say that Lula, in a sense, has his hands tied. There's a limit to what he can do. And so this does not mean that Brazil is doomed, but nevertheless, the very fact that the Brazilians have put into office this far leftist cannot be a good sign for the future of Brazil. Now, Brazil is a relatively young democracy. This is, by the way, a difference between Brazil and the United States. The United States has been a constitutional democracy since, 1789, I guess, when the Constitution was adopted. Brazil has been a democracy since the late 1980s or the mid-1980s. So it's a relatively young democracy. And frankly, there are a lot of people in Brazil who aren't even sure that democracy is the best form of government. It's interesting that in America, people go, they're questioning democracy. Well, when you have a democracy that's relatively new, people do question it. They go, listen, we have to test this system, which has now been operating here in this country for, 30 years, 35 years, against other systems that might, in fact, work better. And also, even within democracy, there are multiple forms of democracy. There's, of course, parliamentary democracy, there's presidential democracy, there's various forms of constitutional democracy, and so on. Even in this country, we debate what kind of democracy do we have and do we want in the United States. So certainly we'll be watching the events in Brazil as they unfold with interest. And tomorrow I'm going to talk further about censorship in Brazil. As in America, it is quite possible, in fact, I would say likely, that censorship on behalf of the left and against the right helped to shape the outcome of the recent Brazilian election.